A very good evening to you all, and a very warm welcome to St Peter Mancroft. I'm Fiona Howarth, the Associate Priest here, and we're delighted to see you all for this, the final week of our Gaia exhibition. And I'm really going to miss Gaia when she's gone. One of the real joys of having this exhibition here has been the opportunity for us as a church to build relationships with other organisations, not least of whom have been Science and Faith in Norfolk. And Professor Nick Bruin has been an absolute stalwart in helping us to apply for funding, and we've really benefited enormously from all the work that he's done. So we're very grateful to you, Nick. Thank you. Before I hand over to Reverend Dr. Patrick Richmond to introduce our speaker this evening, I just want to take advantage of this opportunity with you all here to mention two events. On Friday evening, we have a film night here in church. We'll be showing Thank You for the Rain, which is a film produced with Christian Aid, which is the story of a Kenyan farmer who is already living with the impact of climate change. And it's about his journey to Paris to take part in the Paris talks. So you're all very welcome to come. That's at 7 p.m. You are very welcome to bring your own pizza if you would like to. That's a free event as well. And during the COP26 conference, the Coalition Norfolk Hub is organising a global day for climate justice in Norwich, and there will be a rally on the 6th of November, and there will be speakers outside the City Hall beginning from 1 p.m, and you're very warmly welcome to attend that event. There are a number of different organisations involved, so it will be good to be a part of that. And to let the world leaders in Glasgow know that we are supporting their efforts here in Norwich and all across the UK. And I'd now like to hand over to Reverend Dr. Patrick Richmond. Last week I introduced him as the president of Science and Faith in Norfolk, but he is actually the chair, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Fiona. And as you can see, I am more suited to be a piece of furniture than a president. And it has been a great joy to be working with Fiona and St Peter Mancroft. As Fiona has said, I'm ably served by Professor Nick Bruin, who is a wonderful secretary to Science and Faith in Norfolk. And he has propped up much more than the chair of this organisation. And we're so grateful that we were able to put on these talks under Gaia. I understand that this view of the world dates from 1972, so I've actually lived a bit longer than this perspective on our very vulnerable Earth. And I'm so grateful to all of you coming out during half term to just one of the wonderful exhibitions that are on in Norwich at this time, as Diffie the dinosaur is being lit up in various lights. But you've come to see the whole world, so well done on that choice. And of course, it's not common, is it, to be in a church and find that it's too warm, and it isn't so cold in England now, but from previous talks, I understand that we are sheltered from some of the changes in climate that the world will undergo. They're average changes that we're trying to prevent, and some of those changes will be much more severe than those encountered here in a Norwich church. But I hope that my talk is not going to cool you down, and indeed will warm us up, because we're so delighted that we have Dr. Justine Huxley here tonight to speak to us. We came across Dr. Huxley because she spoke for the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion, but we are broadening our horizons. I did mention that we're taking a global perspective tonight, and Dr. Huxley started her studies as a psychologist, did a PhD in psychology. She became a consultant in communications, dabbled a bit in novel writing. I believe that it isn't published yet, that the world will await with bated breath for the novel to come out. But Dr. Huxley has written Generation Y, Spirituality and Social Change, as she's worked with young people at St Ethelburga's Centre for Reconciliation. Some of you, like me, may remember the IRA set off a bomb in 1993 in Bishopsgate in the city. And the church of St Ethelburga's was severely damaged in that blast and rebuilt as a centre for reconciliation. Dr. Huxley, meanwhile, was in her career an investment banker in the city, and in 2001 she was profoundly affected by the events of 9/11, and in 2007 came to St Ethelburga's, where she is now the CEO and working particularly with young people on vision and to generate resilience as we face the challenges and the divisions of the world being exacerbated by climate change. So as we see our fragile world, please would you give a round of applause as we welcome Dr. Huxley to speak to us tonight.
Thank you so much, Patrick, and thank you to Nick and all of your colleagues for inviting me here this evening. Can you all hear me okay? Can you hear me okay at the back? Yeah? Great, okay. Probably you can't see me so well because one of the problems with being 5'2" is if someone puts you behind a lectern, it doesn't really work that well, but I think I can just about see you guys. So it's wonderful to be here tonight talking about this slightly grim topic, and well done for showing up, because it isn't an easy topic to look at. But it is truly wonderful to be here this evening under this incredible installation, which I'm finding very moving and very mesmerizing. It's very powerful. And yeah, I just look forward to seeing what impact it has on our discussions and conversation this evening, to be having it underneath Gaia, in relation to Gaia. So for me, climate and conflict, these two twin themes are things that I'm totally passionate about. And as Patrick said, I'm the CEO of a charity called St Ethelburga's, which sits at the intersection between climate and conflict, between climate and peacemaking. And to my mind, there's no more important place to be right now than at that intersection. But it's not always so easy to stand up and talk to a group of people that you don't know about this theme. And I'm sure you can guess why that might be difficult. And I think it's firstly because climate is such a politically divisive issue. So you never know how what you're going to say is going to go down with different people. And secondly, because the way our media and the way our culture is at the moment, if you bring anything other than a really optimistic picture, you're likely to get labelled as a doomsayer and trigger people's hostility. So it isn't always easy to speak about this theme in public, and I really invite you to enter into the conversation in a spirit of constructive dialogue. And if you disagree with what I'm saying, then please just stay in relationship with the words and stay in conversation about it, because there'll be plenty of time for discussion towards the end of the evening. And in that spirit of dialogue, if I may, Patrick, I think I might just invite people to introduce themselves. So actually, I'd like to turn to somebody close to you that you don't know, and just spend a minute saying hi, saying your name, and saying what is it that drew you to this conversation this evening. So just half a minute more. If you haven't both spoken, then swap over. Okay. So if you could just draw the conversation to a close. So it's always great to feel that the audience you're speaking into is a little bit connected with each other when you're on this theme. So similarly, it would be great to just get a sense of where people are at. So perhaps I can invite you to just share something about how you feel about the topic under discussion this evening, and just raise your hand if, for example, if you feel anxiety about the impact of climate on our future. Okay. And if you feel frustrated or sad about the world that's being left to future generations. And who feels optimistic about our planetary future? Who feels that actually this is an opportunity to re-engineer how we are, or that technological development will keep us together? Okay. And who feels that we should be doing more than we're doing right now? Okay, 2 hands over there. Yeah, thank you. Great. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about this evening is I'll say a little bit about the landscape that we're in and just the climate science, just very briefly. And I'll talk about some of the ways that climate change is causing conflict or aggravating it. And then I'll move on fairly quickly to how we might respond, as I feel that's really the most important thing. So I don't know where I have to point this little clicker to get it to work. Any ideas? It's definitely switched on. Oh, maybe I'm using the right way around. Little technical hitch, just bear with us. Or big technical hitch, with flat batteries. I'll continue talking anyway, because the slides for this part are not so important. And I'm aware that actually the microphone is changing slightly as I look in different directions. So let me know if it starts failing. Okay, so we're a few days away from the start of COP26, and the people gathered in Glasgow will be drawing very heavily on the data produced by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is really the gold standard in climate change research. And their most recent report was published in August this year. And in this report, they were describing 5 possible scenarios of how our future might play out. So from a kind of business as usual track to the world getting its act together and creating a negative emissions scenario by the 2050s. So really they were looking at the best case and the worst case. And you'll recall that the Paris Agreement was that we should be keeping global warming preferably to no more than 1.5 degrees C above the pre-industrial temperatures. And in this most recent IPCC report, there wasn't a single scenario which was compatible to limiting the warming to 1.5 degrees. So basically, even the best case scenario sees 1.5 degree rise as unrealistic. So we hear a lot about the environmental impacts of climate breakdown, but it's much less part of the conversation how climate will cause conflict and social breakdown. So what I'd like to do this evening is really explore some of the ways in which climate causes conflict. I'd like to do it with my slides, but I'll carry on. And so some of the things that I'll be covering will be the individual impact of heat on individuals, on a bigger scale, the relationship between climate and war. I'll be talking about migration and the pressure that can put on our societies. And I'll be talking about climate and injustice, and about environmental racism, and also about disinformation, strategic use of disinformation. So these are some of the different forms of conflict that I'm going to touch on very briefly, and I'm just going to check in with our tech guy. How are you getting on there, Michael?
Great.
I think we've just got a new battery. Yay, fantastic. Well done, thank you so much. Oh, but that worked. Okay. Okay, shall I continue without my slides then? Tricky decision. Okay, I will continue talking without them. So how climate will affect us as individuals? And this is just a really simple point about the nature of heat. So temperature affects personal irritability, and it increases the likelihood of interpersonal conflict and domestic violence. And heat waves are known to create higher violent crime rates, more swearing on social media. In the US, it increases the rate at which the police will use their weapons, and it increases road rage. So these are just some of the ways in which heat can impact on individuals. But on a much bigger scale, we know that war is made more likely by climate change. So one well-known example of that is the collapse of Syria. And this was triggered initially by a series of failed harvests and droughts, and a number of people moving in large numbers from the countryside to the city. Thank you so much. Oh, there we go. So these are the different types of conflict, and this is the effect of heat on individuals. And here we are in Aleppo, in Syria. There's also a relationship between drought and crop failure and radicalization in many countries. So from Boko Haram to the Taliban, this has been shown. And climate shocks can also electrify ethnic fault lines. So there's a clear link between ethnic strife and climate. And some researchers analysed data across a 30-year period and found that 23% of conflicts in ethnically diverse countries began in months where there were weather disasters. So it's a complex relationship between climate and conflict. It usually aggravates rather than being a direct cause, and it can be quite difficult to unpick. So, as David Wallace Wells, the author of Uninhabitable Earth, said, in many cases, climate is not the sole cause, but the spark igniting a complex bundle of social conditioning. So we have a link to climate in our own very homegrown conflict, which is Brexit. And because this was partly fueled by the fear of refugees overwhelming the country, and climate was an aggravating factor in the conflicts that many of those refugees were fleeing from. So there is a link into climate conflict in the UK already. Scientists have attempted to quantify what this relationship is, and a study from Berkeley University found that for every half degree of warming, societies will see a 10 to 20% increase in the likelihood of armed conflicts. So if you line that up alongside the IPCC scenarios, you can see that there is a parallel increase in armed conflict going to occur. And the US military has been tracking this for many, many years, and the Pentagon issues regular climate threat assessments and is planning for an entirely new era of conflict governed by global warming. So let's talk about migration for a little bit. So currently we have 80 million refugees in the world, and we know that sea levels are rising, and we know that 1 meter sea level rise will cause 600 million people to be displaced around the world. And if the center of continents become unable to generate food, then that number will rise again. And so migration produces tremendous social and political instability and very often leads to conflict. But those conflicts will be happening across a transformed map. The world will no longer look the way it does now. Oops. So, as we know, climate is also a tremendous source of injustice, and many of the countries that are impacted most by climate change are the least responsible for it. And the UN Declaration of Human Rights asserts that we're all born equal, but 2 million people have died as a result of the 5-fold increase in weather-related disasters in our lifetime. And given that 90% of these deaths have occurred in developing countries, which have contributed the least to global heating, the climate crisis is making a mockery of that assertion of equality. And sadly, this injustice often falls along racial lines, and it's made possible by the idea that some people's worth is less than others. So environmental racism is a phrase used quite often in relation to pollution. So the World Economic Forum says environmental racism is a form of systemic racism whereby communities of colour are disproportionately burdened with health hazards through policies that force them to live in proximity to sources of toxic waste such as sewage, mines, landfills, power stations and major roads. So where we put our waste depends on having a hierarchy and labelling some people as dispensable, whether that's poor people or people of colour. So you might recognise this shot, which was from the BBC's documentary Climate Gate recently. And another version of war that's happening around the world right now is, of course, disinformation. The way technology and social media are used strategically to manipulate or control, whether by a nation state such as Russia or by other powerful forces. And the BBC recently raised people's awareness of how this happens in relation to climate with their recent documentary. And I believe the head of the Climate Institute that this actor was representing was actually based here in Norwich at the University of East Anglia. So the cyber attack, most likely orchestrated by the fossil fuel industry, targeted research institutions all over the world, but succeeded in hacking into CRU. And the emails were used by climate change deniers to claim that global warming was a conspiracy and that scientists were manipulating the data. And this is Jason Watkins, the actor who played Philip Jones, portrayed at a moment where he was considering suicide. So this is one example of a new kind of warfare which is pervasive and is being called grey zone warfare. So it's enacted all around us and has tremendous power to influence world events and particularly to exacerbate the polarization which is with us currently. And if this is a subject that interests you, I really recommend Michael Mann's book, The New Climate Wars, which goes into the strategies that the fossil fuel industry are using to manipulate people's understanding of climate change. So many wars and conflicts over history have been ignited by resource scarcity, and that's the world that we're heading into. So we've seen resource conflict recently, not to do with climate, but we've seen the fights breaking out on petrol forecourts as a result of the fuel shortages. And we saw it at the beginning of the pandemic when the supermarket shelves emptied. So on a small local individual level, we know how people react when resources are scarce, or how people can react. And the real danger, of course, is that when resources get scarce, identities become hardened. So this can trigger scapegoating and resentment towards people who are not like us. And so, for example, in the UK, among white working class people, there is often the feeling that there aren't enough jobs or houses or benefits to go around. And that was also a factor in Brexit. But at the hard end, We have the very real risk of authoritarian governments and scapegoating on a massive scale, such as in Nazi Germany. So the polarization that we're experiencing now, when put together with climate breakdown, is an enormous danger. Climate and polarization together are this incredibly toxic mix, these two twin dangers that could begin to shape our world in ways that are almost unthinkable. So this big question, how should we respond? Or I phrased it as, how should I respond? Because in the end it is a personal choice. And psychologically, as Patrick said, my original career was in psychology, so I used the lens of psychology a lot looking at climate issues. And psychologically, if a situation is overwhelming, we tend to employ a whole range of defenses to avoid looking at it or to avoid taking in the implications. And many people now are not climate deniers, but they are still actually really not wanting to look at it because it's actually quite scary. And the disinformation campaign confuses us and enables us to take a possible way out. We can fool ourselves into thinking that maybe everything is okay and we can just carry on and wait for the technological fix, which to my mind is a little bit like falling out of a window and hoping someone will put a crash mat underneath you before you hit the ground. So I believe the first and foremost radical act that any of us can take is to go beyond that defense strategy and actually to face the reality of the situation that we're in. And I was quite influenced by Professor Jem Bendell, who wrote a paper called Deep Adaptation in 2018. Has anyone here come across him? Okay. So in his paper, one of the things that he did was he identified the pressure that people are under to send a hopeful message. And that pervades not just our media and our culture, but also academia and climate science. And so he was a sustainability professor at Cumbria University. And he found that he couldn't actually speak the truth of what he was seeing, or he couldn't explore the possibilities around what he was seeing in the climate science, because there was so much pressure to say, okay, this is bad, but we can fix it. And he really wanted to explore this possibility of what if we can't fix it? So he raised this question, which I found really interesting. He said, are we collectively allowing ourselves to sink deeply enough into the pain of it all? And is it potentially this pressure to be optimistic that is keeping us on the surface and inhibiting deeper change? So this is a very counterintuitive argument. But if you imagine that you'd been diagnosed with a very serious illness, such as cancer, that you're facing a life-altering moment and a confrontation with your own mortality. You don't know how this is going to end. But that moment has real power. It has power to change the course of your life and your thinking. It has the power to help you reorganize your priorities. It has the power to help you sort the wheat from the chaff, and the power to help you forgive people and let go of old grudges. And those moments in our individual life have deep transformative power. So if your job was to be a chaplain to somebody in those circumstances, does it serve that person if you say, it's okay, it might look bad, but you're going to be fine? It doesn't. It might keep them cheerful and save them from a lot of pain, but actually you're also veiling from them the transformative power of that confrontation with mortality. And you're not enabling them to ask this question, what really matters? And how can I live from the place in me where I know what really matters? So because climate breakdown is uncertain, it's a profoundly uncertain set of things that are coming together and that might interact with each other, and human behaviour is uncertain. We don't know how our leaders or how ourselves will respond. So it's this fundamental uncertainty. And what I believe is that it's actually really helpful in an uncertain situation to look at worst case scenarios. So I'll give a little personal story from my own life that supports that, because I'm actually a big fan of worst case scenarios. And when I took on the leadership of St Ethelburga's, this little charity, the finances were very unstable and I didn't know whether I could make it work. And one of my mentors said to me, you know, have your big vision, have your big grand plan and throw everything you have against, towards this big vision, but also look at what you're going to do if it all goes pear-shaped and the organisation crumbles. What's your plan B? How will you, make sure that the work you want to do happens, but maybe happens elsewhere? And that didn't make me feel despairing or pessimistic. It made me feel more secure, because I'd consciously looked at and planned for all the eventualities, from the best to the worst. And I believe that's a very important dimension of responsible leadership. So in 2018, with my team, we took the IPCC report at the time, which was very concerning, into a retreat together, and we looked at the worst case scenarios that could come from that report. And we explored the trajectories of collapse. What will social and ecological collapse look like if our leaders fail to respond, if we fail to respond? What will it look like in terms of food security? What will it look like in terms of extreme weather? In terms of morals and mental health, economics, migration? So we mapped out these trajectories of collapse, and then we walked them in our imagination. We walked into that future. And it was, quite frankly, terrifying. But at the end of the process, we found something really counterintuitive. We found that we felt stronger. And I can really clearly remember how I felt inside at the end of this retreat. And this image is a very poor attempt to capture that. I felt as if we were standing in this very dark place, but we were standing with our feet really firmly on the ground. And there was a realism and an adult responsibility about what we'd just done. And also I realized that the amount of effort we put into not looking, that we turn away from the anxiety, and that actually saps our energy. And there is something energizing and empowering about actually looking at the worst case. So since then, St Ethelburga's has been running many retreats where we begin with that premise. We begin with this imaginative act, walking into the worst case scenario that we are prepared to imagine. And when it's like looking into an abyss, but when we look into that abyss, we can ask ourselves, what matters? I think that's my next slide. What matters? What truly matters? If this is the future that's coming our way, what truly matters? And also, what no longer makes sense? If you have a cancer diagnosis, you may find there are a lot of things in your life that no longer make sense, that you don't want to continue doing or prioritizing. And this is the situation we're in collectively. What no longer makes sense about how we're living? And one thing that's come out of this way of working is knowing about the importance of values, knowing what our values are, and preparing ourselves to be able to live those values no matter how tough things get. And if I imagine walking into that trajectory of collapse, thinking about my personal survival and my own needs, it's a really unhappy imagination. But when I imagine walking into it with my most closely held values uppermost in my heart, so for example the value of service, then it feels completely different. It becomes a testing ground for the spirit, and an occasion that I might be able to rise to in a new way. So one of the questions I'd love you to be with this evening is, what really matters to you? What values do you have that go all the way through you, like the writing in a stick of rock? What really matters, and which of those values will give you resilience if things start to get tough? So when we talk about values or think about them, I see this opportunity. And this is one of the principles of St Ethelburga's work, is to seek opportunity in crisis. So maybe one of the opportunities that we have is that the depth of the need that we're facing, the severity of this crisis, can it be a catalyst for us to live not our best life, because that conjures up something else, but our best selves, to free ourselves from the patterns of conditioning that keep us small. And I think really the essence of the message that I want to communicate this evening is a real rallying cry for one particular quality, and that's courage. So the definition of courage is the mental or moral strength to venture or persevere through danger, fear, or difficulty. And it takes courage to face the situation we're in. And it means to live in the actual reality of what's happening to this beautiful living being that we call Earth. It takes courage not to buy into this myth that everything is going to be okay, this business as usual myth. So what is it that ties you to the way of life that you have now? What is it that keeps you moving along the same tracks or doing what other people expect you to do? And do you think those tracks mean anything in the face of a possible future of human extinction? If you knew you had only 10 years to live, how would you spend them? What's the most meaningful thing you could do? And what do you need to take that step inside yourself? So my belief is that actively choosing courage has the power to transform our experience of what is happening. Oops, whew, I jumped a few. And as Winston Churchill said, fear is a reaction and courage is a decision. So where does courage come from? Perhaps it comes from going beyond ourselves, from letting go of our personal concerns and recognizing there is something much bigger. And I just wonder if in the end it could be a relief to let go of some of our personal concerns, because we live in a very self-centered and individualistic world, particularly in the West, and that creates a certain hollowness, an absence of meaning. So could there be a joy in leaving behind those personal concerns and responding to the need of the moment? And I know in the Second World War there was this huge war effort where women were driving tractors and ambulances, everyone was digging an allotment and growing as much food as they could, and everyone put the war effort first. And through that effort, something terrible was averted. And obviously we need that war effort now. We need national service that sends our young people to plant trees for a year. We need this Herculean effort going into redesigning our economy and our farming systems. But at the moment, our politicians, no matter what their persuasion, are not currently leading us in this way. We don't have a Winston Churchill or a cross-party coalition with a mandate for radical change. And this is much harder because there are no tracks to follow that are being organised for us. But it is also more exciting because we can forge our own path. So how would it be to dig deeply inside yourself and find the courage to meet this situation head on? And one of the things that we need courage for, of course, going back to our theme of climate and conflict, is to be a peacemaker. And the social fabric of our society is becoming very fragile. Our democracy is becoming fragile, and there is a risk of unravelling. And so we urgently need to build communities who can stand some chance of pulling together under pressure rather than fracturing and falling apart. And I think it's really important to know on a deep level that our resilience lies in each other. It doesn't lie in bunkers. It doesn't lie in protecting ourselves. It doesn't lie in stockpiling food and guns so we can shoot our neighbours when they also want that food. It lies in each other. And scientists have found, in the last decade, that trees are not isolated individuals. They're a community supporting each other, channeling resources through their interconnected root systems. And we're like this. So what I really believe is that all of us, whatever our background, we need to recognize the danger of these twin perils of climate and conflict and do everything in our power to be a peacemaker. So what does that mean, to be a peacemaker? It's not a phrase that many of us really know much about or take on to a great extent. So these are a few of my suggestions about what it means to be a peacemaker at this crucial junction of human history. Firstly, come out of the echo chamber. It's very easy not to notice that your life is along certain tracks with people that you agree with. And there is this huge polarization growing, out there. So come out of the echo chamber and make relationships with people. Reach out to people who are different from you and believe different things. And then crucially, stay in relationship with people when these differences and these tensions come up. So even if these people's views are very challenging for you, don't walk away. And I think some forms of climate shock will catapult us into a stronger relationship with our communities of place, our local communities. Currently, many of us spend a lot of time in our communities of affinity with the people that we resonate with, people, like-minded people. But that could change, right? The pandemic changed it. Suddenly we were with our neighbours, and it was this opportunity to actually get to know the people who live in our street. So you might find a certain person's views really hard to swallow, but from a purely practical perspective, when your neighbourhood floods, it may turn out that that person is the only one with an inflatable canoe in their garage. So stay in relationship, no matter what the opinions are. And one way to do that is to try and walk a mile in the other person's shoes, which means, to my mind, to find out the story that exists behind the position. So a number of years ago, I was involved in a dialogue that was held by a peace society in the US, and they were working with abortionists and anti-abortionists, and this was a really full-on conflict. Someone had actually died as a result of this conflict in this community. And the facilitators used various techniques to get to the stories that lay behind this position of pro or anti-abortion. And there was a turning point in this dialogue where one of the anti-abortionists told a very moving story about how she'd had an abortion herself and had been really negatively impacted by it. She'd felt very damaged by it. And so this really helped to humanize these people for the other side, to recognize that there are all sorts of stories behind people's beliefs, and that nothing is black and white, and that everyone has a reason for the position they adopt. And it's down to us to have the curiosity and the willingness to discover what that reason is. So hearing people's stories, the stories beneath people's beliefs, whether it's about their politics, their relationship with COVID, their relationship with climate, it's understanding the stories is what gives birth to relationship. You can also learn conflict transformation skills. It's not rocket science. You can learn the skills easily. And again, if climate shocks force us into close relationship with our local community, and in that local community fault lines emerge, and things start getting really tricky, conflict transformation could make all the difference. It could be a survival skill for you in that situation, as well as something of huge value that you could offer to your community. So if things get tough, who will stand in the middle between the warring groups and remind us of our humanity? Maybe that person could be you. I think it's also really important to engage in any opportunity-specific dialogue. that come your way. So these dynamics may threaten the future of our democracy. And democracy, in part, rests on our ability to have difficult conversations in the public square. So where you get the opportunity to participate in those conversations, then do. And if your role in the community or your connections enable you to bring people together and host those conversations yourself, then do that too. So at St Ethelburga's, we're developing a new strand of work which we're calling Viewpoint Diversity Dialogue, which is about creating conversations across the political and cultural fault lines on really hot topics. And so, for example, climate and racism are some of the topics that we address. And we'll be teaching the skills of how to facilitate those conversations constructively so that people on different sides of the argument can actually learn from each other rather than just shoot each other down. And I believe that's a skill that is really very much needed and that we're actually losing. We're losing it very rapidly. So it falls to people everywhere to actually be part of the solution and to stop that fracture from disintegrating us further. I think there's also something to be said about social media and disinformation as well, about our capacity to get drawn into social media wars or be responsible for inflaming certain conversations. So I think it's really important to learn how to be with social media in a way that actually builds community rather than destroys it. And in terms of disinformation, critical to try and limit the impact of fake news on us, which is a big task. You know, it means checking facts from original sources, which is quite a lot of work. And it also means reading from a broad range of news sources. I think that's one thing that all of us can do that really helps, to seek out news sources and media that go against your current positions and see what you can learn from them. So I grew up in a household where my parents were very disparaging about people who read the paper The Sun. But now I watch podcasts and listen to videos made by the Sun newspaper regularly, and I find it hugely helpful to get an alternative view on reality. So it's helpful for me as a peacemaker to be able to understand that alternative reality. So I think I've been talking for quite a long time. So to conclude, I just want to repeat my three main messages. I think, you know, as we sit under this powerful reminder of the beauty of planet Earth and the knowledge of how much is being lost and how much is at risk. My hope is that we'll be able to remember that our resilience lies in each other and that we need to prepare. And that three things are helpful: to use worst-case scenarios as a way of empowering ourselves and going beyond the paralysis. To be a peacemaker in every way, shape or form that you conceivably can be, and primarily to stay in relationship with those whose opinions you disagree with. And lastly, to remember that fear is a reaction, but courage is a decision. Thank you. Does it mean I can come out from behind my lectern?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you so much, Justine. So we did talk about the possibility of further discussion before questions.
Yeah.
So do give a lead on that if you feel led, Justine.
Yeah.
But I was thinking
to jump in.
I have a dog collar on. I'm not the only one in the house who has. And indeed was just today preparing a sermon for All Saints' Day, this Sunday, on Blessed are the Peacemakers, the Beatitudes. So I felt sort of warmed and affirmed. But can you talk about perhaps a value from religious traditions that you think is helpful here, and perhaps something that religious traditions might need to guard against that wouldn't be helpful? to start us off, but if you want to call us into
Sure, yeah,
discussion or anything else. And,
might actually, just if I may,
Michael, do you want to reclaim the conch and take control of the conversation?
Yeah, I'll just share a little bit about a value that's embedded in my organisation. I'll just flip through a bunch of slides and get to, because I've got a picture somewhere. Yeah, so this is one of the principles St Ethelburga's work is based on, and all of our principles are drawn from the history of the very unique building that we find ourselves in. And this is our patron saint, St Ethelburga, and she gained her sainthood by responding to a pandemic, the plague in the 6th century. So her story is super relevant to what's happening now. And she was very young in her leadership when the plague came to Barking, where she was an abbess. And we like to tell this story about her, that she had a choice to make. She could stay in the monastery, close the doors, and just retreat into prayer, or she could go out into the community and serve as a chaplain for the dying and as a healer for the sick. And she chose to do the latter. And so we draw this principle about putting values into action, but it's also primarily a story about service. And I feel very strongly that the principle of service is so much needed at the moment, and that's so rooted in our faith traditions. It doesn't matter what your faith is. You know, service to others and service to God is a fundamental principle of faith. And I really believe that this is, along with courage, service. An attitude of service is what can really transform our experience of any kind of challenge, whether it's about climate or anything else. So that would be the value that I would choose, the value of service. And thank you for the question.
You mentioned, sorry, with my mask it's hard to speak, you mentioned training that
Yeah, I'm really sorry, you might need to remove the mask to...
Is the training that the church or St Ethelburga's is doing, is that available to people in the community? How do we find out more?
Training in conflict transformation? Yeah, actually at the moment, the conflict transformation work tends to be embedded in a program that we call Radical Resilience. And so this program looks at the realities of climate breakdown and then looks at how we can strengthen our communities within that. We also do teach about conflict coaching and conflict transformation skills. If you go to the website, there won't actually be anything up there at the moment on conflict, but if you sign up for the newsletter, you'll see them when they come up. So yes, and please do them, definitely. That was an easy question to start with.
Thank you very much indeed for your presentation. And the thing that's in my mind is what you said about how often we have in the past anyway made associations by affinity. You know, we've kind of networked around people who we feel we're similar to. And something about the lockdowns suddenly made us realize in a very spatial way that actually how close we are to our neighbours in a very kind of physical sense. And of course the whole issue of climate change and the fact it's all very geographical means that this is, you know, perhaps at the heart of the issue of how we can address this and how we can keep that optimism that you were hinting we need to hold on to. And I'm wondering really whether although courage is important and the values, there's something quite earthy and kind of spatial about all of this as well, and the sort of rootedness in our locations perhaps. And this is an issue that the first, what we call the first world, the kind of rich bit, the west bit of the world, has lost that sense of place. Fiona and I minister here together at Mancroft, and that's one of the themes that came out in some of the conversations we had with a few people here. You know, that sense of rediscovering a deep sense of place and where we belong. And of course some of that plays into fears about migration because we're worried we're not rooted in our place enough to be welcoming enough, probably. That's probably what it comes down to. So I'm wondering, alongside some of what you've said about courage and service, is there just something very basic about needing to be comfortable in the places where we live and then love the places that we live in, and then be welcoming of others into those places? And maybe that's part of how we can hold on to a future with hope and optimism.
Yeah.
Is that a question? I don't know. It's more of a reflection. But you know, is that perhaps part of what you work with as well at the centre in London?
Sure, I find that a very moving reflection. Thank you, and I really couldn't agree more. Does anyone else resonate with that, with the need to grow a much deeper relationship with place? Does anyone else feel the power of those words? As a geographer, yeah. Mm. Do you want to give the mic to Mark?
No, I don't want to say more.
Yeah. I mean, I feel I really resonate with the words of the Buddhist environmentalist Thich Nhat Hanh, who says, we have to fall in love with the world before we can save the world. But which bit of the world do we fall in love with? I mean, we have this whole image in our hearts and minds, but the thing that we really need to fall in love with is the place where we live, is the place where we belong. And I think it's true for very many reasons, what you've just shared. And I was fascinated in lockdown of how my relationship with my immediate environment got so much deeper, so fast. And it was like suddenly my relationship with my garden, my neighbours, every single bird that visited the garden, all the lives of the people that I was connected with around me suddenly became so real and so present and so alive for me. And at the same time, because we were all using Zoom, everything became instantly global, and things which were kind of small local events suddenly were attracting people from all over the world. And for me, it felt as if there was something really important in that experience of having this very deep connection with my immediate environment that was so nourishing and so rich, and having this absolutely global outlook and feeling connected on this much bigger level. So I really resonate with what you say. Do you want to elaborate? Do you want to say a bit more? Because that was so beautiful. Sorry, I've got really bad hearing. I don't know if you can turn the volume up on the mic. I was struggling a little bit to hear it.
Well, clergy can always keep talking. That's a drawback, I suspect. I suppose, in a way, this is the Science and Faith Network, and where are the helpful levers in actually a thoughtful approach to science, which perhaps can help us as well in all of this?
Sorry, where are the helpful leaders?
I said levers. The kind of what bits of science can we pull on as well to help with all of this? Not so much just let's dream up the latest advance or bit of scientific progress, if it turns out it's just kind of ratcheting up what we've done for the last 3 generations. What's a new way of using our ingenuity to kind of re-embed ourselves in the planet? I'm sounding like some kind of weird idealist probably, but I am an optimist. I'm always full of hope. And I'm not quite sure exactly where that hope is to come from, really, at the moment.
I think that's a great question. I'd love to hear your answer to it and to other people's answer to it. My own response to that would be that the science of interconnectedness and the science of interdependence is where the answers lie. And so there's this incredible understanding coming out of the world of ecology and zoology, biology, in every field you can name, about the interconnectedness of life. And those learnings are showing up as systems theory, as kind of, sharing economies, as kind of different technologies of doing things in an interconnected or interdependent way. In every field there is known to humanity. And to my mind, it's technologies that reflect interdependence, which are the technologies of the future, and that is where the hope is. And I also feel hopeful. I mean, despite images of Nazi Germany, I feel that humanity will get through this, and we will birth a new era which is rooted in that understanding of interdependence. It might take a while to get there. We might have to go through a lot of pain, but that is the opportunity that we're facing. It's the re-engineering of human culture. So it is rooted in that interbeing. You know, and also I believe rooted in a sense of creation as sacred, as the natural world is sacred. Not in a religious way, but in a way that's, you know, profoundly meaningful. So I don't know, what would your answer be? I feel like you meant it in a slightly different way, right? Oh, sorry, you're clergy, you don't want to talk too much. Anyone else got an answer to that, or a question or reflection?
More a reflection than a question. I think that what dismays me is that throughout the COP26 lead-up, and probably for years before that, the stance of world leaders is always how little can I get away with rather than how much can I do. And I wonder what hope there is that people will see the common good as the only way out of this. And while we're looking to minimise our contribution rather than to say, what resources have I got that can give? It doesn't matter if I don't get as much back, but to give. I don't know what the answer is, but I suspect there's something of a question in there.
I think that's a very important question. And I think it reflects the culture that we've built for ourselves, which is very individualistic and self-centered and greed-dominated, and that pervades our thinking. And so it pervades the thinking of many of the leaders and the government heads who are at the COP. So yeah, I mean, this lady down here just also asked, you know, what to look out for at COP. I mean, I think I don't know, I'm interested to know what other people think. You know, it's a huge question though, and I think it's really important that you named it. Any reflections on that? On what can take us out of our selfishness? Or what will enable our leaders to come out of that self-centered way of thinking about things? Yes. Oh, sorry. Young people, thank you. Yes. We'll come to you first. Oh, what a gentleman. Let's pass the mic over to you.
Is in young people. Young people will stand up and they will have to react. Yeah. Because it's their future. It's their future. And the future lies with young people. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I really, really resonate with that because, you know, Patrick mentioned the book that I edited, which was a collection of stories about how the younger generation are responding to the social crisis in general across the world. And it relates back to this principle of interdependence, because what I see, not in all young people, but in a certain subculture of the younger generation, this understanding of the interbeing, interdependence of things is really alive and is really lived in a way that's different from how it's lived in my generation, which was what inspired me to write this book. And actually Charles Eisenstein, the economist, he put it really succinctly. He said the younger generation is standing more firmly in the story of interbeing. And I think that really sums it up. So for that reason, I really agree with what you say. But at the same time, I think it's very important for us not to put the solution onto the younger generation because, you know, this has happened on our watch. And, you know, although we might not be individually responsible, we do share a collective responsibility for what's happened. And I think it's really important not to put that onto the younger generation and say it's your future, solve it. And I know you didn't mean it in that respect, but I think we have to be really careful when we say that it's the younger generation that can save the earth, because it's a shared responsibility for all of us. Yeah. Yes, you had a...
Yeah, I've stolen the mic back, and so grateful to everybody else. But when you were asking about what will make the politicians act, I mean, risk of stating the obvious, there have got to be votes in it, haven't there? And you've been talking about polarisation, and as I understand it, a lot of getting elected is about having your base. That you've got a certain number of people who will vote for you. You've got to keep them happy and then go into the centre ground, and you hope you'll get enough extra to get you over the line. So politicians will be looking to see who will vote for me from my base. And if that, and picking up Ed, the other vicar in the house, who's got, it's his house, so it's his rules, but the attachment to place, if it's NIMBY-like, if it's not in my backyard, it will see a threat to the beloved place and its change. And I think we need to get to a point where the politicians can see that people are interconnected, do have an interest in others, and are not just seeing this as a threat to their locality or their way of life or their source of income. You know, it would be relevant to an economy that's very dependent on fossil fuels and that sort of industry, that reacting to the climate change crisis might destroy livelihoods. Well, there aren't going to be many votes in that.
Yeah.
So I think we've got to generate some understanding of interconnectedness, as you say, that shows that there are votes and not just defensive self-interest.
I think this is, there's a lot in what you just said, Patrick, but the thing that really jumps out to me is that it's our political system that's preventing us from solving it, because the political system is based in duality. So the political system is based in this kind of old era consciousness, and we don't yet have a political system that reflects that interdependence. And to my mind, that's one of the major stumbling blocks, is that change hasn't happened. And that that people don't know what that looks like. People can't even imagine what it looks like to have a political system that's not based in voting for either this or that. So I find that very, disheartening to look at. But I don't know very much about the Second World War, but I know that Winston Churchill led a coalition, and that coalition had, this mandate to stop everything and redesign everything and focus just on this one thing. And I think until we have a politics that's operating across party lines, we're going to struggle to solve this. And I don't see what the solution is for that currently. Do other people have ideas? Can someone inspire hope and optimism in me around politics?
I wasn't going to respond to that. I had a general question about the relationship between politics and politicians, which is essentially the power base that changes
sure,
communities.
Let's hear that then.
But under against that, certainly in historical times, that there was an opposition between church and state. So church as an institution, not just in this country but all over the world, provided a kind of moral basis on which political strength was empowered. Do you think we've lost that connection in any way? And I'm not just talking about the C of E. I'm talking about faith communities in general. Are they strong enough to drive the ethics that underlines politics?
What do you think? What do you think? The short answer, no. I think I would tend to agree with that. I feel there is faith communities is one of the things that's held us together, hasn't it? Because people might have had a shared religious identity whilst having different politics, whereas now we're in this situation where that's not true in the same way, and we have a much wider range of religions and people aren't so religious, so there isn't this uniting factor that is holding us together across the political and class divides. I think that, if I was going to give a monosyllabic answer, it would be no as well. But I also think this philosophy and worldview of interbeing is also rooted in the spiritualities of the world. It's somewhere. It's in our traditions. And I feel like actually for the younger generation, what I saw in the young people that I worked with was actually that sense of interconnectedness almost was a religion. That almost was their spiritual model. Regardless of which tradition they identified with or didn't identify with, many of them were outside traditions, but it had this dimension of being like a spirituality. So I don't know whether there can be, whether the science of interbeing and the the spirituality of interbeing could be united to create a worldview that can enable us to re-engineer how we do everything. You know, I do believe that's possible.
I can agree with all of that, and just want to push you one stage further. So taking an organisation like Extinction Rebellion, which, if you like, is a collection of individuals who are trying to coalesce around a common idea, do you think that's got the mileage to influence politicians in the near to medium term?
Yeah, I hoped it would. I was very much in support of Extinction Rebellion when they emerged, because I do think the situation that we're in requires that kind of action. It requires breaking the law to bring our leaders' attention to focus on how serious this issue is. But what have they achieved? I mean, they brought climate up the agenda in the media and up the agenda of politicians, what politicians were looking at. But ultimately, not very much has changed, and they've become very dissipated as a movement, and you know, they've become lost in all the issues around how to make the movement more diverse, which is really important. They have to go down that route, but it seems like they've lost power from that original, you know, when they burst onto the streets in 2018, there was a certain potential there, and I don't know that that potential has been lived out. So, I don't know. Sorry. And I don't know if there's anyone here who's involved in Extinction Rebellion who might have a different view, because certainly my intention is not to diss it as a movement. I think it's a really fulfilling a very important function.
Just to go back to your idea of worst case scenario,
Yeah.
I was listening to the news before I came out tonight, and someone said, if you add up all the promises that the world governments have made, it is nowhere near enough to make COP26 successful. At what point do we stop thinking about, to borrow a phrase from the church, revival, and start planning for survival?
Sorry, at what point do we...
What is going to be the tipping point where it's not going to work? We're not going to do it. So, and our politicians, I don't think, are facing reality.
Yeah. I think that, I mean, I do resonate with what you're saying, but the one thing I would say is that I think the possibility of transition lies in collapse. So when things start collapsing, you know, there is, like, we're kind of held in lockdown, like globally at the moment, we're in kind of lockdown because our politics can't change anything and our corporates have got too big a hold on what happens, the vested interest. So it's like when things start collapsing, some of that will be shattered, you know, and within that shattered space, there will be the possibility for people to organise differently at a local level and be able to live out some of these principles. And I don't know if you know the work of, her name will come to me in a moment, she wrote a book called A Paradise Made in Hell. And what she did was she analysed disasters that had happened all over the world and looked at what emerged in the aftermath of a disaster. And she was very articulate on this point, that the structures which keep society operating a certain way, in the absence of those structures, when they've fallen, there is this potential, and there is the potential for individuals to actually relate to each other differently, to bring different parts of themselves to bear on the situation, and to kind of, for something else to emerge out of the rubble. And just as, you know, it's our story at St Ethelburga's that the IRA bomb destroyed this church. And the church was stuck in a kind of financial dilemma of a tiny congregation and blah, blah, blah. It was all really difficult. And I got bombed. This new life came out of the rubble. So it's like, I believe that actually, you know, maybe before COP in 2009 in Copenhagen, humanity had the possibility to transition into a different way of life smoothly. And for whatever reason, we weren't able to take it. So now we do it the hard way. Now we watch things collapse. And in the freedom that that collapse brings, yes, there'll be a lot of suffering. Yes, there'll be a lot of pain. But those structures will collapse, and that will free something up, so actually then things can change. But it may be that, you know, a lot of structures have to fall before we can do that. And it may be that the international collaboration doesn't work, and that actually we're just forced back into, can local communities somehow survive?
And it won't be the rich people of the West who suffer so much. It'll be the developing world.
Which means we have the responsibility in the West, we have the responsibility to get humanity through this.
I don't think we're facing reality.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I have to say I'm really struggling to hear people. I don't know if anyone else is also struggling to hear the questions. So when you hold the microphone, can you hold it like up, like that? No, like up.
It's not a question. It's following up on what you were saying about collapse. There are precedents, of course, in history. It has been argued that out of the Roman Empire came feudalism, and out of feudalism came the Renaissance and capitalism and all that. So there's a good precedent. And maybe it's right that sort of thing will happen. I've been thinking a lot about Saudi Arabia.
About what?
Saudi Arabia.
Ah, okay.
Lately, because it's never mentioned when you talk about climate change and what is going to happen if we actually succeed in cutting down our carbon. Because here's an economy, a country, a political system, even a religious system, that's totally dependent upon petroleum. So are the Gulf states. What is going to happen there? And Saudi Arabia, if I got it right, did issue a statement today saying that by such and such a date, it will be completely carbon neutral. Well, you can believe that if you like. And there's a potential, of course, because of sunshine, enormous amount of sunshine. And they have been running experiments for a long time using solar energy to produce power. But they've never come, as far as I'm aware, to producing enough electricity to run the country. And they're never going to do that because of the influence of petroleum and everything that goes with that. The whole country, the whole system depends upon that. And they are influential, partly because they have the money at the moment, and partly because they can cause an awful lot of trouble, one way and another, politically, in the Gulf against Iran. Who's behind the sanctions against Iran? Saudi Arabia, who has been stirring up a lot of the Islamic troubles in the Middle East and elsewhere. Saudi Arabia. There's going to could be a lot of trouble there. And it will be stirred back by climate and the fundamental opposition to modifying global behavior.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. Any last questions, thoughts, reflections? Oh, this gentleman right at the back. Was that a hand, or were you just... Oh dear, sorry, you just bought the painting for £6,000 and... Okay, looks like we're done.
So thank you so much, everyone, for coming again and for interacting. And let's give Justine a round of applause for facilitating our communication. And thank you so much, Fiona and Ed, for your hospitality in this place and for showing that the theology of place that you articulate, Ed, is one that is open and hospitable and certainly is in your backyard and in this place of worship as well. Fiona, I think you were talking about people bringing pizza on the 9th. I was thinking, Justine, as you talked about mysticism, that the sort of pizza people should be bringing, please bring one with everything. You want to... So Justine has talked and it stimulated us in a wonderful way to think about how we can build resilience, be courageous, and make progress in peacemaking. So we do indeed need to have that scientific understanding, that sense of connection, and that pizza making us one with everything will just add the topping on top of it. So Justine, I hope you have a safe journey back tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, everyone. I hope you will have a wonderful half-term week, and there are boards that Nick Bruin, our wonderful secretary, has provided. If you want to do it the old-fashioned way, to sign up to our communications list, that would be wonderful. Justine has talked about St Ethelburga's website, where you can find out more about what they do and sign up for their newsletter. We have a newsletter as well for Science and Faith in Norfolk. Please do find us on Facebook and on the web, or sign up to Nick's board if you want to stay in touch. God bless you all, and do pray for COP26, and do encourage people to encourage our politicians to do the right thing and break down those self-interested barriers. And good night. Oh, and I think there is a device that allows cards to be taken, as well as the old school bowl. So if you're able to contribute to the upkeep of this wonderful building and keep things going, that would be fantastic.